Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, which brings you these weekly Medical Center Hours. We're delighted to see all of you here today. Our program is titled Sugar with an exclamation mark. This title, short and sweet, is intended to cover a lot of territory. Yes, sugar is this intensely sweet stuff for which humans are said to have evolved a dedicated tooth. But it's much more. Sugars of many types fuel life's engines at micro and macro levels. Sugar is a driver micro and macroeconomically. Its production and trade having shaped nations and colonial empires. Its lack or surfeit figuring in nutritional policy, dietary guidelines, and defining household and social economies alike. So why do Americans eat so much sugar, and to what effect? Sugar gives us energy, it pleases our palates, sweetens our tea and our chocolate, and so much more. It ends our meals on a high note, it sparkles at our celebratory occasions. And why does this matter, especially to personal health, and also to medicine and public health? The answers aren't hard, and yet they are complicated. Sugar rots our teeth, it adds calories to our diet, it ups our blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C numbers. It's one culprit in the present public health epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes in 21st century America. And all these facets of sugar's crystalline presence in our lives raise a bewildering array of questions. So this Medical Center Hour offers dual perspectives on the sweet stuff, on what it does to us and in us, and on a few of its many meanings in history and for health. We are happy to welcome today UVA Assistant Professor of History, David Singerman, and UVA Physician Associate Professor of Medicine, Jennifer Kirby. Together, and they didn't know each other really before this invitation presented itself. So it's been an interesting dynamic as they have tangled with their respective expertises in shaping this dual presentation. Together, they'll introduce us to sugar in what may be some new and eye-opening ways as they look at sugar's impact on the body, past and present, historically, socially, physiologically, nutritionally. And I'll just mention this is the last of our History of the Health Sciences lectures for this academic year. We gratefully acknowledge our ongoing partnership with historical collections in the Health Sciences Library for these history-minded medical center hours that also look acutely at things that matter today. So now, without further ado, sugar. David.
This okay? People can hear me? Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks to Marcia and Jen for making this possible. I'm looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have. So my talk today is called, What Story Does Sugar Tell? We all know that modern Americans eat a lot of sugar, but as I was doing the research for this actually, and I mostly study the 19th century, I wanted to know how much is a lot. And it turns out that a lot is really a lot. You can see here, we consume about 175 pounds per person. Amazingly, as Jen will talk about, that's down from its peak in the mid-90s. And you can see at the bottom of the chart that refined sugar has kind of gone down a little bit from its mid-century peak of 100 pounds per person or so, and that's been more than made up for by high fructose corn syrup, corn sweetener, and then just at the top are the tasty ones like honey and maple syrup. Compared to the rest of the world, we are like a huge outlier, about 3 times the global average, it turns out. So one question is, where does all of that sugar go? So here's one answer. Just watch
Okay,
what
Mary, if I
happens.
give you these four here,
Right.
Okay.
what I'd like you to do,
This is an iced bun.
a diagonal line, about 3/4 of the way
It's
through.
got icing on it and sugar in the
Diagonal
dough.
line.
Diagonal line.
Below the icing.
Yes. Open up the fingers and pipe in a generous amount of cream.
You've made a few of these in your time.
I've done a few. I've done a few of these in my time. Finish by piping a line of
Jam
jam
over
across
the
the
cream on the iced
and
sugar
top
bun.
with a dusting
And
of
then
icing
some sugar. Okay,
There you go. Some classic ice buns filled with cream.
There you go.
And a line of jam.
I can't even imagine eating one of those. Okay, so that's where the sugar goes, right? And after today, I suspect that if any of you are fans of Bake Off or any of its affiliated shows, you'll still want to watch them. I love the show, but you won't watch it in quite the same way anymore. So that's one explanation for where the sugar goes. It's in everything. When I tried to, cut out refined sugar for a month, the thing that surprised me the most was that it was in bags of rolled gold pretzels, have sugar in them, so I couldn't have those. So that's where it goes. Where does it come from? Is kind of what I want to talk about today. The trouble is that you actually can't often ask the sugar itself. So sugar in the raw, which many of you will know from Starbucks and stuff, says it's natural cane sugar from Hawaii. It's actually no longer from Hawaii. This packet is a couple of years old. The last Hawaiian sugar mill closed down about 2 years ago. These other packets tell us a little bit more, right? The one in the middle has a kind of like vaguely tropical vibe, right? And it says it's fair trade and it says it's cane sugar, so you know that it's from the sugar cane. But the one on the right, which any of you who have been to a conference or anything like that will know, because it's the generic Cisco Corporation sugar packet, just says sugar on it, right? It could be from anywhere. And so this idea that sugar is from anywhere and is kind of all the same is what I want to talk about today. We can contrast that to coffee, right? If you think about your kind of normal hipster coffee shop, right? There are these big kind of artsy black and white photos of sugar farmers somewhere like holding the beans in their hands, right? Sugar is like single origin, but single origin sugar doesn't really exist. A couple of years ago, I was at on vacation in Italy, and at a kind of roadside like cafe, I picked up a little sugar packet, and it said on it, "Every coffee tells a story," right? And it's impossible to imagine that for sugar. We just don't have that kind of interest in it, or we don't think about it that way. And the question is why? So this is one of my very favorite books about sugar in the Caribbean called Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar by the great Cuban anthropologist and sociologist Fernando Ortiz from 1940. And what he did in this book was he analyzed the history of Cuba through the histories of these two commodities. Tobacco, he says, is very individualistic, and sugar is very kind of collectivized and corporatized and controlled by, was the vehicle for foreign domination of his country. And there's a line in this book that I think really speaks to the question of where sugar comes from and why we don't know. He says, sugar comes into this world without a last name, like a slave. And so that relationship between sugar's status and its history and what's visible and what's invisible is really important. Because one way to think about the modern history of sugar, and as I tried to compress the modern history of sugar into a 20-minute presentation for today, what kept coming back to me was that it's a constant struggle between, on the one hand, efforts to expose sugar's origins, and on the other hand, efforts to keep those origins hidden for purposes of profit mostly. And so there's kind of three themes that I think will bring this out. The first is violence. The second is state power. And the third is ecological damage. So first, violence. Sugarcane isn't native to the Americas. It comes originally from somewhere in the region of South Asia, but it spread over the centuries to the Mediterranean. And this is a kind of somewhat fanciful description from 16th century Sicily of a small sugar factory. this point, sugar was very expensive, right? It was a drug and it was a luxury. It was not the kind of thing that you could put in your coffee. But because it was so pricey and so valuable, it was something that if you could grow it on a large scale, you could make a lot of money out of it. That was the kind of thinking at this, around 1500 or so. And so actually Columbus himself, like not a kind of generic, like, Columbus, like the Spanish conquistadors of the invasion, like Columbus himself brought it on his first voyage to the Americas. And his son actually set up a sugar plantation on Hispaniola for himself. But mostly in the New World, sugar cultivation was on a small scale for the first century and a half after the Columbian Exchange. And it's important, at some point, kind of like early on in every talk that I give about sugar, I have to explain how it's made. And so I'm going to try to do that in like 30 seconds. The basic features of making sugar from the sugarcane are that you cut it down. You grow the sugarcane and then you cut it down. That's happening kind of on the right there. And then all the way on the left, you crush the sugarcane to release the juice. And then kind of in the foreground, you boil the syrup slowly while removing impurities to grow crystals out of it, right? Or crystallize the sugar out of the solution. And so this is obviously, again, not drawn from life in the way that we now would expect illustrations to be. It's more demonstrative, and again, from about 1600 or so. But by the middle of the 1600s, this scale of sugar production really started to change. And a series of technological innovations began in Brazil and spread across the Caribbean from island to island. And I'll talk about that spreading in a moment also. These innovations of various kinds made it possible to have much larger plantations than before that earned really vast profits by selling sugar to a wider market than had ever been possible. In 1650, for instance, Barbados, which you can see a contemporary map of here, was the most advanced sugar-producing country on Earth. And you can see down at the bottom, can't really read it, but all of those names are the list of sugar planters who have established plantations along the coast. It was hugely profitable, right? Really unheard of wealth accumulated by private citizens, right? Because it wasn't aristocrats who were leaving England in this case and coming to Barbados to start a sugar plantation. It was various kinds of ne'er-do-wells or whatever, but like commoners essentially, who would come and make their fortunes in Barbados. If any of you were here about a year ago for James Delborgo's talk on his biography of Hans Sloane, the founder of the British Museum, you'll have learned that Sloane's fortune, which enabled him to purchase and acquire the collection from around the world of curiosities and oddities that then became the foundation of the British Museum, was derived from his wife's fortune made as a sugar planting family in Jamaica. And if any of you have seen 12 Years a Slave, you'll have some sense of the conditions of what sugar slavery were like. The film begins where Solomon Northup spent much of his time, which is on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. And sugar plantations were known as the most vicious, brutal working conditions in the Americas. They had high death rates, even compared to the cotton and tobacco plantations that we're more familiar with here in mainland North America. And statistics vary, but about 80% of Africans brought to the Americas as slaves went to work on sugar plantations. So mostly not, again, to Virginia and the east coast of North America, but to the Caribbean and Brazil. So as part of this sort of technological revolution that I talked about, mills became much bigger. You can see here, so they could just absorb more sugar. The boiling houses where slaves stood and worked over these cauldrons became kind of increasingly like proto-factories, right? Hot and humid and noisy. Part of the suffering came from the tempo of the work, right? Because once the sugar cane is cut down, the juice starts to ferment. And so to maximize the profit and the profitable crystals that you could get out of it, mills ran around the clock during the harvest, day and night. One thing that sugar planters didn't really like to admit, though, is that they actually didn't know how to make sugar. The people who knew how to make sugar were the slaves. So one planter from Antigua wrote in the 18th century that, quote, "The art of boiling sugar is generally least understood either by overseers or their masters, but trusted wholly to the skill of Negro boilers." And actually, especially skilled slaves called sugar masters would test the syrup by dipping their fingers in, by stretching it between their fingers, and listening to it crackle to know when it was ready to be transferred from one cauldron to another. But at the same time that they actually didn't know really what was going on, these planters were presenting all these new technologies and inventions to the Royal Society in London and other kind of learned societies in Europe to get the scientific prestige that came with being the discoverer of something or the inventor of something. But the truth is actually that mostly the enslaved people were the ones who, first of all, came up with these innovations, and second of all, spread them from island to island in the Caribbean, as I mentioned earlier. But this was kept invisible because, for reasons you can imagine, right? Racial theories and gentlemanly codes made it unthinkable to credit these slaves with their accomplishments. So after their production of sugar on these plantations, it was packed into massive barrels called hogsheads that you can see here, which weighed hundreds if not thousands of pounds, and was then loaded onto ships to be sent to Europe, where consumers could put it into their tea and into their coffee. As Britain in particular went from a kind of farming nation into a factory nation, sugar's energy, as Marcia was saying, made the industrial diet possible, the industrial workers' diet possible. That's the famous argument that the anthropologist Sidney Mintz makes in this book, which it's in the additional readings, and I encourage you all to have a look at. And you can kind of see this growth of the sugar argument, this argument about the growth of the sugar market in the Great British Bake Off, right? How many people have watched the show or have seen some episodes? Okay, yeah, right. Enough of you. So you'll know that there's kind of two kinds of things that they bake on the show, right? There's sort of the aristocratic patisserie tradition, right? And those often have some segment in like a castle. And then there's the kind of working class cake and pastry and bun tradition like the one that we saw. So the violence that I've talked about was hidden, but there were voices speaking out against it. And one image in particular came to symbolize the inhumanity of sugar slavery. So on sugar plantations, as I said, the cane got fed into rollers, and so slaves would feed the cane into these spinning rollers that were powered by animals or water or wind, or sometimes by humans, as you can see in this picture. And what would happen is that limbs and clothing would get snagged, right? So every sugar mill, a kind of integral part of every sugar mill, in addition to the what we think of as, or what you might think of as the machinery of the mill, a crucial part of it was also a hatchet or a machete that was always kept close at hand to chop off an arm or a limb before the whole person got sucked in. Excuse me. Now for the planter, this was as much more in fact, about saving the expensive equipment as it was about saving a life. And the amputee slave became a kind of common rhetorical symbol for abolitionists. So in Voltaire's Candide, they're wandering in the Caribbean and they encounter a slave who's missing a hand and a leg. And they ask him how he's come to be injured in this way, and he says that he lost his hand in the mill in the way that I've described, and his leg was cut off by his master when he tried to escape. And what he tells the protagonist is, "This is what it cost you to eat sugar in Europe." Or here's a British political cartoon from the late 1700s attacking the barbarities of the West Indies. A member of parliament had told a story about a slave who got submerged as punishment in boiling sugar for 3/4 of an hour. And so that's what's happened in this cartoon. And in the upper right, you can see an amputated arm that's been nailed to the wall. So abolitionists called for a boycott of sugar and rum from the West Indies. This pamphlet said, "If we purchase the commodity, we participate in the crime." And he calculated that in every pound of sugar used, we consume 2 ounces of human flesh. And instead, people were encouraged to use sugar from other parts of the world, mostly what we now know as India, where sugar was not produced by slaves, not under great conditions, but not by slaves. And so those who participated in the boycott were encouraged to advertise their opposition by using sugar bowls like this, which says, "East India sugar not made by slaves." So you're encouraged to serve this to your guests and make them feel uncomfortable and participate in the boycott with you. Excuse me. So in the late 1700s, about this period that abolitionism is beginning in England, the most valuable and profitable sugar colony on earth was the French island of Saint-Domingue, right? But in 1791, the slaves of Saint-Domingue, as hopefully you all know, rose up and threw off European empires, first the French and then the British and Spanish who tried to reconquer it. And so this brings us to my second topic, which is state power. So the French Empire under Napoleon found itself suddenly cut off from the main source of sugar. Plus, it was being blockaded by the British Navy, and so it had limited access to foreign sugar from other places. And so Napoleon, pretty desperate, turned to a new invention in hopes of satisfying the domestic appetite that had been generated by centuries of cheaper and cheaper sugar. And this invention was called the sugar beet. And I call it an invention because that is really what it was. It was like, I always think of it as sort of like Frankenstein's monster because it was sort of jolted to life in this like Middle European lab at around the same time. But the real point here is that nobody had ever gotten the substance called sugar from anything other than sugarcane before, nor would anybody have even thought to. Like sugar was what came out of the sugarcane, and that's just, that's the way it was. But this German apothecary painstakingly crystallized a substance from his like local humble vegetable and concluded through microscopic observation and what he called its strong sweet taste that it was, I'm quoting here, not merely a substance approaching sugar, but in fact a true and perfect sugar which has complete resemblance with the familiar sugar extracted from the cane. So this is exactly what Napoleon needed. He funded and subsidized beet sugar factories throughout his European empire. But as you might be able to tell, the idea of beet sugar didn't make a lot of sense at the time, and so it was sort of widely mocked. And here's a cartoon that I really like. This is from 1811, and so on the left you see the nurse telling on Napoleon's son to suck on the beet because your father says it's sugar, and on the right is Napoleon trying to squeeze a beet into his coffee. And you know it's Napoleon because he has a big N on his hat. So this government-funded and government-subsidized beet sugar spurred the development of huge new machines that would transform the way sugar was made everywhere, not just in the kind of temperate climates where beets were grown. Things like steam-powered mills for grinding much more sugarcane more quickly, vacuum-sealed chambers where it could be boiled more efficiently, and centrifuges that dried tons of sugar like in huge salad spinners, basically. And so older sugar mills and boiling houses that looked like this gave way to giant industrialized factories across the Caribbean. And there's a sort of complex relationship with industrialization and the end of slavery that we can talk about in the Q&A. And as a result of this mechanization, sugar got even cheaper and more widely available. And you can see here that it goes from, in 1830, this is US per capita consumption, goes from 10 pounds in 1830 all the way up to 80 pounds in 1910. So fortunately, despite the high statistics I showed at the beginning, it hasn't continued, right? Or we'd be eating like a ton of sugar a person. What happened as a result of this, kind of incidentally, was that there was a tariff on imported sugar which was designed to protect American refiners. And because sugar imports were spiking, this tariff became a huge source of government revenue. So as Marcia reminded me earlier, in the 1880s, a sixth of the federal government's whole budget came from sugar taxes. So sugar was important in that way to the state, and it was also important because sugar refiners became the biggest employers in American cities, and as a result of both of these, they became very politically powerful and had presidents and senators in their pocket. So here's a political cartoon from 1894 satirizing the political power of a monopoly called the Sugar Trust, which controlled about 90% of American sugar production. And what's happening here is that the Sugar Trust, in a chariot shaped like a barrel, is pulling President Cleveland in chains, after passing a favorable tariff bill, favorable to it, that is. As you can tell from this, sugar refiners weren't popular. They were accused, for instance, of adulterating their sugar with all sorts of poisonous substances. The caption here says, "Look before you eat and see if you can discover any adulterated food." And he's got this kind of device into a sugar bowl. In response, refiners drummed up fears against foreign sugar. Not slavery this time, or not only slavery this time, but other fears about contamination. So this is a contemporaneous ad from the late 19th century for refiners, but it's posed as a kind of like infomercial, right? This sugar mite, which you can see blown up on the left, was this horrible insect that caused itching and disease. There were supposed to be tens of thousands in every pound of raw sugar. And there was a widespread scare about this. It is totally made up, as far as I can tell. I was a little bit concerned when I read about it, and I couldn't find any sort of contemporary or like present day information one way or the other. And then I found a letter from one sugar chemist to another in the 1920s, kind of, one of them says, like, remember that sugar mite scare of the 1890s? Like, that was so funny. I can't believe anybody fell for that. But so this all sort of like testifies to the political power of sugar. And one last piece of evidence for that is if we look at a map of where in the early 20th century cane sugar came from for the United States. So there's Cuba, and there's Puerto Rico, and there's the Philippines. And you may notice that all of these are places that America happened to seize in a war with Spain from 1898, right? And the other place is Hawaii, where a coup by sugar planters was supported by the US government, which then went on to annex it as a territory. So the way to think about sugar at this period, or for the hundreds of years before it, is similar to like the oil industry now, right? Immense sort of geopolitical significance. And this brings me to my, my third and final topic, which is ecological damage. And I'll be considering ecology in terms of like, I don't know, a little broadly, put it that way. So boiling all of that sugar takes a lot of fuel. And one result of this is that sorry, back up for a second. You recall earlier that I said that these kind of technologies of sugar plantation spread from Brazil through islands of the Caribbean. One reason that kept happening is that islands would get rapidly deforested, right, by the need to cut down all of the trees to burn for fuel. And that's sort of another reason that these new technologies became adapted in the 19th century, because the cost of wood fuel became so high that it was necessary to develop new machines that could burn the dried cane stalks as fuel, which weren't as efficient or as readily available. It took a little bit of manipulation to dry them out, enough so that they could work in a boiler. But wood fuel was so expensive, and it was too expensive to ship cold air, that these new machines became not only profitable but necessary. And these huge sugar factories of the late 19th and into the 20th century that I've talked about were kind of, as you can just see, right, like devastating to the landscape. What's visible here is the kind of clear cutting for miles around. But also the infrastructure for these factories was incredibly damaging. You can see the railroad lines going in, right? And those railroad ties came from somewhere. So here's a section of the forest in Cuba that's been felled for railroad ties. And if you look at a kind of historical map of the sugar industry in an island like Cuba, which over the 19th and early 20th centuries kind of increasingly became like the leading sugar producer of the world, it goes from pretty much the western half of the island eastward into newer and newer and newer like virgin territories because of this demand for fuel. It was also like just dirty and polluting, right? As many Victorian and early 20th century factories were. And you can see that here, not just the railroads, but just the kind of, grime and smoke that's covering the environment. And this is captured really well, I think, in a painting from a Puerto Rican artist from the early 1900s called El Genio del Ingenio, which means sort of roughly like the spirit of the sugar factory or the temper of the sugar factory. And this painting captures, obviously, the violence against human beings, but also the clear cutting of the landscape and the pollution of the air, and even the pollution of the soil itself, right, in the blood that's pooling. And so I said I was going to treat ecology a little bit more broadly. And so I'll ask the question of what did sugar do to its eaters, right? Well, let's ask the sugar industry in 1950. This is a pamphlet produced by Quaker Sugar of Pennsylvania. And the message of this pamphlet, in 1950, excuse me, the message of this pamphlet is sugar is good for you, right? And if it says, under where it says sugar is a food, it notes that if you ate only sugar, you could get all of your calories for $30 a year. Under these goodies are good for you, there's something called jam cake pudding, which maybe will be on the next season of Bake Off. And here's a blown up bit. It says, the high dietary value of sugar is universally recognized by scientists and physicians. Jen can confirm this. It is vitally necessary for you to have a goodly amount of sugar in your diet, and important medical authorities tell us that for health and enjoyment, there is no substitute for sugar. So this is sort of bad enough, right? Recently, scholars have found something that we might consider more insidious, which is that internal sugar industry documents from the 1950s and 60s show that sugar companies kind of modeled their political strategy on tobacco, funding and publicizing studies that supported sugar and attacked other dietary components. Meanwhile, labor in the sugar industry in the United States itself, well into the 20th century, was still horrible. In the 1940s, the U.S. Sugar Corporation in Florida was actually prosecuted by the United States government for slavery. Prosecutions for slavery are kind of rare, but this corporation was prosecuted for it. And as late as the 1990s, this company was still bringing in so-called guest workers from the West Indies and forcing them to work in what were essentially plantation conditions. After exposés like this one in the New Yorker, which is also in the show notes, the company rapidly mechanized its harvesting. But the environmental damage still goes on. The companies that make up so-called big sugar in Florida dump, fertilizer-rich runoff into Lake Okeechobee and into the Everglades. Florida's like algae bloom in the fall and summer was at least partly blamed on this politically influential industry. And this is the weirdest thing I found in my research for this talk. It's from an article in Vanity Fair that in the Starr report, Ken Starr mentions that like when Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton are talking at one point, he gets a call from one of these politically powerful Florida sugar growers, and says he has to take the call. The current sort of story that's become interesting to me as well is the battle between these Florida growers who are rebranding themselves as organic and sugar beet farmers in the US West who have been using GMO crops for quite a while. And because of our new, because of consumers' desires for organic produce rather than GMO produce, the price of these two commodities has actually diverged. So those are the three themes that I think kind of capture this tension between the hidden and the exposed in the history of sugar. And I want to end on a note that I think captures the way that, despite its very sordid history, as I've tried to outline here, the sugar industry actually has had quite good PR. We don't think of that we don't think of it as being like a very popular industry these days, but they've been good at publicizing themselves for about 500 years. So thank you very much, and I will leave you with this. Sorry, I shouldn't just drop the mic. This is a promotional video from 1950 from the Tate & Lyle Sugar Corporation of Great Britain, which was under the threat of nationalization. So they produced this infomercial explaining how fabulously important it is. Yeah, happy sugar farms. You can stop it. Thank you.
So if it's okay, I'm going to wander a little bit because I don't like to be tied behind a stand here. But thank you, David. I actually loved it, and I think it sets up a really nice discussion about the involvement of sugar in disease. And so when Marcia initially reached out to us, she said, "Jen, I really need to have you come and tell everybody that sugar is so bad and it's the cause of diabetes and obesity." And I was like, "Okay, well, but we don't know that." And she's like, "Oh, well, then you need to tell them that too." So I put this slide in as sort of as the question: what is the role of sugar in disease? And I think David is nicely laid out. We have a sordid history with sugar. And I think we continue to have a sordid present with sugar. And so I'm going to elucidate a little of that and hopefully muddy the waters a little more about the role of sugar in our diet and the role of sugar in disease. And so it is, I think it's important to define sugar. So I know there's probably a lot of non-medical people in the audience, but we throw these terms around: sugars, carbs, right? Everybody's low carb, keto. So sugar, which is defined really as is table sugar, which is what has been refined from both the sugar cane and the sugar beet. They really were sucrose, which is table sugar, and it's what's called a disaccharide, meaning two sugars, glucose and fructose. Sugar is found everywhere. It's in our bananas, it's in our apples, it's in many of our vegetables. It is just part of our diet. And so I don't think anything inherently bad about it. I think a lot of what we're talking about is a definition of something called added sugars. So the extra that we put into our diets, I think, is really where I think gives us pause. So what David had talked about, our consumption of sugar has increased significantly, mostly around what he was talking about, these added sugars, high fructose corn syrup, corn sugar sweeteners, and just refined sugars. And so this was derived from a really great article in the Washington Post, and I encourage you guys to take a look at it. It's got a nice little graphic. I probably should just use the graphic because it was nicer than mine. But really is, we talk about sugars and sweeteners, and this really is kind of sets up a definition. So, partway down, we've got our refined sugar, our refined sugars. These are fructose and glucose. Remember, sucrose, which is just table sugar, is that disaccharide of glucose and fructose. We've got high fructose corn syrup, and this is kind of a contentious part of our diet in that in the 1970s, under Nixon, corn subsidies were invented to help the local U.S. farmer. And one of the things that they produce is high fructose corn syrup. The name is a bit of a misnomer because it's not all fructose. There's a couple different varieties of high fructose corn syrup. There's 55 and 42, and all that refers to is that it's about 55% fructose versus 42% fructose. The remaining of it is glucose. So it's still both fructose and glucose. But you can also see sort of these sweetness factors. So maple syrup and, oddly enough, honey is a little less sweet than table sugar, although it's got a lot of sucrose in it. Stevia, anybody heard of stevia, right? It's the natural sweetener. So it comes from a plant, and it's actually really sweet. It doesn't have calories. So there's this appeal. We've got a natural sweetener that is not caloric, doesn't add to our waistline, and we'll circle back on that. There are the sugar alcohols. These are things that you see in your sugar-free candies. So the story I like to tell is, these are great. They're sweet, roughly about the same sweetness as table sugar. They're not calorie-free. They're sugar-free. If you eat a lot of it, you get diarrhea. So that's a negative. So the story I tell is my poor patient who had diabetes, and he was desperately trying to quit smoking. And so he found that the sugar-free peppermints were the way that he kept himself from smoking. The problem was he was going through a bag a day. So one, he had a lot of diarrhea, and two, he also was gaining weight because they're not calorically deficient. So just keep an eye out on those. So the sugar alcohols are not necessarily a replacement. And then the artificial sweeteners, and these have really come under fire for a lot of different reasons, but you can see the significant difference is their sweetness factor, hugely sweet, right? You have receptors on your tongue. You have taste receptors actually in your gut as well that kind of detect the sweetness. And one of the things that has been thought is that when you have this level of sweetness, you actually bypass your brain's ability to feel satiated or to feel full. And so there's an argument on one hand that adding these sweeteners bypasses that your body's ability to be like, I'm good. I had my 2 lumps of sugar in my coffee and I'm okay, versus my Splenda and I'm like, I'm going to go eat that muffin. So that's debatable, and that data is very mixed. But the other piece of this also is because they're artificial, there's been a lot of concerns around things like risk for cancer and heart disease, et cetera. And again, these are difficult studies to do, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So sugar's everywhere, right? When we talk about sucrose, it's in a lot of our foods. So this is kind of the breakdown of what's in a banana. So when I have patients who are like, I really shouldn't be eating fruit, right? Because sugar's bad. And I'm like, well, maybe not. So part of this is the context of what you're getting with your sugar. And I think that that actually is a very important piece of this. So bananas have potassium and magnesium. They're a good source of some vitamin C and B6, but they also have fiber. And we know that high fiber diets are actually really important for reducing our risk of heart disease and diabetes. And so this context, this is not necessarily, these aren't bad sugars. And the other piece about this, so the sugars here is about half and half glucose and fructose. The other part about this, too, is that it's really hard to tell what the sugars are when you read labels, right? How many of you guys look at labels when you're buying foods? Yeah, right? We're all talking, you got to look at the label. How much sugar's in there? So can you tell, if you didn't know that this was a banana, right? If I just showed you this label and I said, how many added sugars are in this food product? You can't tell, right? So this could be a yogurt. It's not, but it could be a yogurt, and you wouldn't be able to tell. So yogurt, there's a lot of added sugars to foods that are otherwise probably pretty healthy. And so this is a challenge, and I think one that the industry is wrestling with around is, should we be putting labels for added sugars on things? So let's talk about sort of the nitty-gritty. How is sugar related to the things that we are concerned about? So we know that there's an epidemic of diabetes in this country. We talk about 31 million patients with diabetes. A lot of them don't know that they have diabetes. What's even scarier is the nearly 90 million people with prediabetes. About 85% of those patients don't know that they have it. So I have prediabetes. It pains me to say it. It's a genetic thing. My mom has diabetes, and so I've assessed my risk, and I have prediabetes. But there it is. And so this is not uncommon. And so there's a lot of patients out there that you wouldn't think of having risk for diabetes who potentially do. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm guaranteed to get diabetes, but I have an increased risk of things like heart disease and lifetime risk of diabetes. About 9.5% of our population in Virginia have diabetes, concentrated a lot in our southwestern part of our state, as many of you guys are aware, as well as on the eastern shore. Often socioeconomic places. This is a great graph from Lancet last year. It was a little brief article, and this is NHANES data. So NHANES is a great source of epidemiologic data that we get as physicians and epidemiologists and public health folks looking at the prevalence of obesity in the United States over time. And what you'll see, there is a very clear inflection point, right? Right about 1975. Our rates of obesity in this country started going up. And this is independent of sex, age, race. Every population is affected. And one of the key pieces from this article that I really liked is that clearly there's something going on epidemiologically. You can see the inflection. The problem is we don't know what it is. There's been lots of postulates about what's driving this. But one of the key aspects I will say, and I love, there's a quote in this line that they basically say is, this has not been due to a collective failure of willpower. This is not about us losing our ability to say no to food and exercise more. So one of my roles and one of the hats is that I'm an obesity medicine specialist. And I think one of the biggest things that I fight against is weight bias. And this idea of you just need to eat less and exercise more. And that is really, really a very inaccurate picture of overweight and obesity in the world. So what's changed? What's driving that inflection point? And there's been a lot of proposed drivers of this. Many of you guys have been around through the low-fat craze, right? So the American Heart Association was, and Big Sugar was in part driving some of this, but it was like, oh, fat's bad. Oh, fat's bad, right? And so everybody went down to removing their fat of their diet. And so how many of you guys remember like the SnackWells and the 100-calorie snack packs, low fat, right? So what do they replace it with? Carbs, sugar, absolutely. And so there's a lot of suggestion that that low-fat craze drove the obesity epidemic and which is also driving diabetes. And the problem is that's not been consistent with the evidence, meaning that you see this little dip that in the slides that David showed you of our consumption of sugars and carbs, and it's actually dipped. And yet obesity is not slowed down, and we're continuing to see rises, particularly in the higher ends of BMI. I mentioned the corn subsidies from the 1970s and the increase in high fructose corn syrup. So it's interesting from a biochemistry standpoint, fructose is processed differently in the body than glucose. Remember, sucrose or table sugar is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. There's a lot of fructose out in our diets as well, and fructose is metabolically different in the way it's processed. But how we understand that has been really difficult to tease out. So I remember sitting in my first year biochemistry class in medical school, and I was like, oh, this is how it works, right? There's Krebs, and there's a TCA cycle, and there's glucose, and there's where fructose goes. There's some overlap. We get a little lipid stuff over here, and we get a little ATP over here. Well, it turns out it's actually a little more complex than that. And so it's very difficult because of those overlaps between these, how these things are metabolized, is that you can actually get some fructose that gets converted to glucose. And then you kind of have to figure out, well, where did that fructose go? Is it in glucose or is it going to the lipids? And so it's challenging, but one of the things that is out there is that it's the high fructose corn syrup. But again, some of the data is not very clear, and also our consumption of some of these have gone down over time, and yet our obesity rates are going up, our diabetes rates are going up, our fatty liver disease rates are going up. We've certainly seen an increase in processed and ultra-processed foods, right? So ultra-processed meaning is that everything is kind of chopped up and then brought back together to make some semblance of a food item. Chicken nuggets are a great option, a great example of that, and so it's, it resembles chicken protein meat, but not really. There's also been, so the sugar industry was also big, and actually it was the sugar sweetened beverage industry has really been pushing this idea. Well, it's just really because we're all sitting around, right? You can drink your Coke as long as you go out and have a run. It's okay, which is not true. So what does I say to my patients, and I say to when I'm lecturing to students and residents and fellows and everybody else, is you cannot outrun your fork. Exercise does not drive weight loss. It is really good for everybody, and everybody should be out there doing it, but it is really not the key to weight loss. But I will say is that when you are an avid exerciser, so anybody who's seen like ex-athletes who have spent many, many years doing a lot of physical activity, and then they go from being a professional athlete to retirement, often associated with weight gain. So that reduction in physical activity absolutely does have an impact on weight, but it's not the sole cause. All right, so as we mentioned, sugar intake over time has increased. It kind of plateaued or reduced during the Depression and World War II, which we knew because for reasons of production. It peaked again in the 1990s, but it's been reducing since 1996 in terms of our refined sugar intake, and as well as sort of things like the high fructose corn syrup. So I don't think it completely explains our difficulty with obesity and diabetes in this country. I will say that probably the data around sugar-sweetened beverages is probably the best in terms of associative data in terms of weight gain. So we know that sugar-sweetened beverages are really problematic. And interestingly enough, they're widely available. And we talk a lot about things like food swamps and food deserts, where you can have access. So I love the quote from the sugar industry is you can eat all of your calories as sugar and not spend more than $30 in a year. Yeah, but that's probably not a great idea. I mean, so, you know, you get off on any exit on any highway in this country, and what do you find? Highly overprocessed, ultra-processed foods. It's really calorically dense, got a lot of added sugar in it. You cannot find an apple to save your life. I was at a hockey game with my son up in Northern Virginia, and I went to get gas at the Sheets next to the rink, and I was walking through to get a cup of coffee, and I was just kind of perusing, right? Wow, is there really any food there? So when you talk about nutrition, there was really nothing of nutritive value, minus the few really brown bananas and Red Delicious apples that were at the front of the store, which if anybody knows, Red Delicious is really a misnomer. They're not the most Red Delicious of apples. I digress. All right, so there's been a swing, right? There's been a swing from like, oh, fat is bad, right? So to, oh my gosh, sugar is bad. And the real question is it inherently dangerous? Is sugar in itself toxic? Is it causing problems? Or is it that we are having an increased intake of it, and the increased intake is causing weight gain, which it does. If you eat all of your calories as sugar, you're gonna be in trouble. Because you're not really just going to eat all those calories. The sugar, you're going to eat more than that. But is the sugar itself inherently dangerous? And that data is really, really hard to get at, and it's not there. It's not like sugar doesn't cause diabetes. Sugar doesn't cause heart disease. We just don't have it. So is it a yay or a nay? I can't say because we just don't have the data. But the American Heart Association has really tried hard to say well, we want to come up with good recommendations. And so 2009, they published this, and I love their daily added sugar limit. And I went back to look at this because I was trying to figure out, how did they get to this idea that I'm only supposed to have 25 grams of added sugar a day, and David gets to have 36? Like, not fair. But the way they came up with this is they said, okay, average American woman, average American man, what are their caloric needs to get to their daily requirements of nutrients, minus how much they need to eat to maintain their weight, and those are your fun calories. Woohoo! And so we get about the average American woman, it's about 200 extra of fun calories a day. If I've eaten just enough to get all my nutrition, and I'm maintaining my weight, I get 200 extra calories to spend as I wish. So half of them I get to do as added sugars. So this is how this data came about. And so it's really not entirely scientific, because anybody who has tried to lose weight in this room? Yeah. You get those apps. I'm a 48-year-old woman. I weigh so many pounds. I'm not telling you. I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm going to plug it in. Okay, I get to eat this many calories a day. And I methodically go and I do this. And turns out those predictors are really not that good for everybody, right? So you may be on this end of the scale, right? Where you may lose a ton of weight with that many calories because you actually need more calories per day. Or I may be the person who's way down here, I can't eat nearly that many calories, and I'm metabolically challenged, and that stinks, but that's kind of life. So those calculations are actually not great, but there they are. What does sugar do? I think you can safely say in a lot of cases that added sugars, depending on what you're eating, can increase triglycerides. This is a surrogate marker for heart disease. This is not the slam dunk. This is the cause. It may reduce your healthy cholesterol, your HDL. It may raise your LDL. Again, that data is very limited. Certainly, there's a concern about glucose and insulin. So I'm going to do that one in a minute. Association between, this one's a bigger association. But again, it's an association based on epidemiology data. But certainly beverages, the sugar-sweetened beverages, just get rid of them. Drink water. This change in our hedonic pathway activation and how we view satiety. So if you sit down and have an omelet compared to a honey bun, how full do you feel? And the risk, and this is a big one, I think, amongst kids. If you're eating a bunch of crap, you're not getting healthy stuff to the exclusion of the healthy stuff. And that's the real risk. And I think it alludes to what David was talking about in sort of these environments where if you've got the local bodega that only offers chips and soda and highly refined foods, you're not getting the things that you need. This is the conventional model, thinking about weight gain, that we overeat, and we have reduced energy expenditure, and so we've got increased metabolic fuels, and we've got increased fat storage, and we gain weight, and we get diabetes, and we have overweight and obesity. This is a more contentious model, the carbohydrate insulin model, but it's one that's out there, and I think it's worth addressing because this really does get at the sugar piece, which is that by eating the carbs, which is a sugar, you actually drive higher insulin secretion, which makes you store fat, which makes you have perceived lower circulating fuel sources. So your body thinks, hey, I'm starving. And then it says, hey, I'm hungry. And so it's the eating of the carbs that actually drives the hunger, that drives the weight gain, and drives the reduced energy expenditure. And this has not been proven, but is out there. I love the fact that we had the same slide. The sugar industry is not passive players in this. So the question is, here we are, it's 2019. We've been dealing with sugar for hundreds of years. Why do we not know the answer? And the bottom line is, these studies are really hard to do. Nutrition studies are incredibly costly. They're hard to do long duration studies, in part because do you choose endpoints that are surrogate versus clinical? Are you looking at triglycerides, or are you looking at people having heart attacks? Heart attacks take 30 years to investigate. Are we doing epidemiologic studies, historical versus a prospective trial? Historical has been very easy to get data, but it's also, it's completely, it's riddled with problems like, Megan, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Or what did you have for breakfast 10 years ago? What have you been eating for the last 20 years? Really, really hard, versus the cost of providing people like dedicated meals to eat day in and day out for a year. So bottom line is, I don't think we have a good problem solved yet for this, but what is my take on sugar? So here's my anti-bias slide. If you see a person who has some extra weight versus somebody who's thin, don't assume that the person who has the extra weight is eating crappy food and not exercising, because I don't eat very well. I exercise a lot. I'm working on my food. But the thin person is also not always the healthier person, right? We all know those people who drink sodas every day. They're thin. They're of the 15% who are genetically thin and will not have problems with overweight and obesity. So the bottom line is, so what do we do? What do I tell patients? How do we deal with sugar? I'm like, well, I love the Michael Pollan quote: eat food, real food, real food. If you can get it. If you're in an inner city and you don't have money and you can't get access to fruits and vegetables, we're in trouble in this country for that reason. But eat food, real food, not too much. Portion control, mostly plants, including fruits. This was advice given to a study that was published last year. It was really good. If you guys get a chance to look at it, Diet Fits, and I'll end here, is that their advice was they randomized people to low carb and low fat, two different groups. They gave some specific advice, but they gave all of this advice to everybody in the group, which was maximize your vegetable intake, minimize your added sugars, your refined flours, and your trans fat. That's pretty simple advice, right? Shop around the periphery of a grocery store, get whole foods, make it at home. Don't go out and buy stuff from McDonald's. It's still not going to be the cure for the obesity and diabetes epidemic, but we'll be a heck of a lot healthier. And I will stop there. Thank you, guys. I know a lot of you guys have to leave, but David and I can stick around for questions.
Mm-hmm. We have time maybe for one or two quick questions from the audience that we can capture on the recording, and then again, both Jen and David will be here to talk with you. Who is here with a question or a comment? Okay, let me come up to you.
I'm Sally Telford, and I just have a comment. As you ended, Jennifer, I could make some other comments, but I was part of the Women's Health Initiative from the very beginning in Atlanta in 1993, and am still part of it, but not in the same way. Mm-hmm. And I am amazed when you finished that the diet, one of the things that impressed me about that study was its dietary advice that was given to all of us as participants. And it was very much, it comes out pretty much where you ended in terms of diet. And for me, it's worked many, many years, but it is it was focused in the beginning, of course, on oils and fats, and that was its primary focus. But it was really done wonderfully well, and a lot of money was invested in that study.
Yeah.
And so I was glad to see where you came out.
And from a medical professional, the Women's Health Initiative has given us a ton of data across a wide range of topics.
Yes, they have.
And so I think that these studies are really important to do. They're expensive and they're hard to do well. But it is interesting. We sort of kind of come back to some basics.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that recommending this and following this are very different. So when you look at clinical trials or clinical nutrition studies where they've recommended specific diets, so if you look at the Diet Fit study, which is a great study, it's a free living study. So they followed people for a year. They said, hey, go do this. They don't track what people eat. It was recorded. People were recording it, but they weren't given the food, and so there wasn't that control. But really, at the end of the day, was that what they showed, that study showed, was like a lot of other nutrition studies, was some people lose weight. A lot of people lose a little bit of weight, and some people gain weight. And so in my world around treating obesity and overweight, is that when people like, you got to tell me which diet, right? I kind of say like, well, we got to find the one that you're going to stick with. If you like eggs and cheese, and I'm sitting there telling you to be a vegan, you're not gonna do it. So I think we have to, so there are keto diets that work for people. There are a lot of people who can't do the keto diet. So I think it's really a balanced approach, and this is really, for a starting point is, let's try to get rid of those added sugars, but it is hard. And the industry doesn't make it easy. Yeah, so it's a great question, or great comment.
I think what we'll do is close the formal portion of the recorded program. But again, if you would like to come and talk to Jen and David for a few minutes afterwards, we'd encourage that. Please join us next week. I know it's UVA spring break, but we are doing a program in partnership with the School of Nursing with Roshi Joan Halifax from New Mexico in a program entitled Edge States as Opportunities for Courage and Compassion. And we will look forward to seeing you all then. Please join me in thanking David Singerman and Jen Kirby for a global tour of sugar. Thank you.